Welcome to this special standalone Be Our Guest episode of With All Due Respect. I'm Michael Jensen and
I'm Megan Powell-Dutoit.
And our very special guest today is the Anglican Archbishop of Sydney, Kanishka Raffel, who has been the Anglican Archbishop of Sydney since 2021. And he's also an immigrant, British-born from Sri Lanka, of Sri Lankan descent, immigrating to Australia as a young child. Before becoming Archbishop, he served as the Dean of St Andrew's Cathedral in Sydney and then in pastoral ministry in both Canberra, Goulburn and in Western Australia. Raised as a Buddhist, he came to Christian faith at university. And we asked the Archbishop on for our immigration episode, but he was on a well-earned sabbatical. But in the light of further events since recording, such as the Bondi and Minnesota shootings, we're still keen to talk to him about this issue that burbles on. People are still very into, still a pressing issue across the Western world and in Australia too. And he's graciously joined us today. So welcome, Kanishka.
Thank you, Michael. Thank you, Megan, for having me.
You're an immigrant to Australia yourself, as we've just said. So how does your own story shape how you respond or relate both faith to national identity?
Yeah, thank you. My family migrated to Australia from Canada in 1972, late 1972. So we were right on the cusp of the official abolition of the White Australia policy.
Yes, yep.
I was 7 or 8 years old at the time, so only a child. I do remember the family story of this is that my father attended the interview in Toronto or Montreal or wherever it was with the Australian High Commissioner because he was a Burgher, as they're called, the Sri Lankans of European descent. So he was a fair skin. Right. And he attended the interview for our visa rather than my mother. Anyway, who is dark complexion like me. We came to Australia at that time in its history, and so that means that my two sisters and I, both my parents being now deceased, commemorated 50 years of life in Australia just recently, just a few years ago. Certainly for me as a Christian, I had a tremendous sense of gratitude to God for all that has unfolded in my life as a result of us migrating to Australia, including, in my case, the fact that I came to know the Lord Jesus Christ through the human agency of Christian friends that I met here. So, we, the three of us, I think, my two sisters and I, have a very strong sense of thankfulness to Australia as a nation for welcoming us and for the fact that we have pretty much pursued what most of us in Australia regard as the ordinary opportunities of life, which are, in fact, great privileges if you take it globally.
Yes.
We've pursued those things really without hindrance of any kind. And I've reflected in the past that I've come to see that my own story as a migrant has in fact been less hindered than it may have been if, for example, I was born as a First Nations person in Australia. So we feel very thankful in that way. And there are certain things about being a migrant, of course, which I think are typical. Certainly as a child and a teenager, I was a little bit awkward about my cultural background. Although amongst my peers, sort of second-generation Sri Lankan migrants, or not sure, I suppose I was first-generation because I wasn't born here.
Right, yes, yeah.
People of that age, we had a kind of unspoken solidarity because we recognised that we were living, as it were, between two cultures. We knew we weren't actually Australians in a sense.
Yes.
And yet we weren't as our parents were either. And so we did occupy this kind of middle space. When you in that space, certainly in my experience, you just want to fit in. Mm-hmm. You just want to kind of keep a bit of a low profile and make sure you get by. Ironically, I did have, I had certain experiences as a result of my accent and my vocabulary, which did occasionally lead to somewhat humiliating experiences. But my accent was Canadian.
I was about to say, was it British or Canadian? So that's intriguing because I actually had problems with my accent growing up in Sydney public schools because this is not my natural accent. I Aussieified it.
Right.
So I had much more, which is very rare among Australians. I had like a more RP kind of Kate Blanchett kind of, because my father's father was English and so on. And it didn't go down well in some of the public schools in the areas of Sydney that I grew up in. So it's interesting how that the way that you sound can be quite as significant as the way
Yeah.
that you look, I think.
Mind you, that was true for my wife as well, who moved from country New South Wales to Sydney
Ah,
when she was about 10 years old. So she encountered the same thing.
so for having too much of a country accent.
Yes, well, they thought she was very English.
Right. How intriguing. Yeah, I mean, othering is such a common human instinct, isn't it? It's really interesting there how you talk about being an immigrant and it puts you sort of on the margin in sense of you're not one and you're not the other, which strikes me as a little bit like the Christian experience. Have you ever thought about that connection?
Well, I suppose I have I guess, perhaps more so, as I think many Christians have over the last sort of quarter of century or so,
Yes.
as we've been more acutely aware of that
Mm.
marginalisation. Certainly the last census kind of confirmed it in a quantitative way, but I think many Christians have felt it qualitatively.
Mm.
Of course, I became a Christian in my 20s, so just about 40 years ago. And as I have reflected on faith and the experience of migration, I've been, I guess, heartened, strengthened even maybe, by the fact that God really creates multiculturalism as an act of judgment, right? At the Tower of Babel, humanity is united and share one language, and as an act of judgment, God scatters them and confuses their language. But, of course, he is a God of redemption and he redeems multiculturalism in the gospel. So, this is a very wonderful thing. And so at Pentecost, the gospel is proclaimed in many languages. In Antioch, the only place where the literal walls that divide the ethnic quarters of Antioch, the only place where they actually come down is in the Church of Jesus Christ. Where the recitation of the names of various elders and what have you in Acts 13 or Acts 11 and Acts 13, I think is Antioch. But when there's that recitation of the names of those who were serving there, there's sort of North Africans and Jews and Roman citizens and various kinds of people. And in Antioch, of all places, that is a most unlikely thing. Of course, the great wall of hostility between Jew and Gentile is brought down in Jesus so that in him there is one new humanity. And then John glimpses heaven and sees that the praise of the Lamb by every tongue is in many languages, that people are there from every tribe and language and people group. And so there does seem to me to be a very clear biblical principle about the equality of humanity and a praiseworthy diversity.
But here's the interesting question, though, isn't it? So how do we then apply this Christian principle? We have the Spirit and the cross to unite us, right? We have Jesus to tear down the wall. How do we then apply it to Australia, to a political world? Because multiculturalism is a secular alternative to that, isn't a secular model of bringing nations together, just as empire was before it, by the way. Empires were multicultural in their own way. How do we do that?
Well, I do think that there are many places in Scripture where we have some models with which we can work, notwithstanding the particular kind of cultural differences. Certainly, I go to 1 Peter, which identifies the Christian community as both experiencing a kind of exile, strangers, that is remote from our heavenly home, and yet participating as citizens in a social environment which they inhabit here. And what is the kind of frameworks in which people are supposed to kind of occupy that space, live such good lives among the pagans, that though they accuse you of doing wrong, but this is a great thing about 1 Peter, it continually references the fact that the Christians are not only a minority, but they are unjustly oppressed. They maliciously slander you. Give your answer with gentleness and respect. Though you are accused of doing wrong, live well so that they glorify God on the day of his visitation. Presumably either having been persuaded by your testimony in word and deed to join you, or compelled to glorify God, because it turns out that this really was the community that belonged to him. And Peter, of course, says, be frightened, don't be afraid. And I think fear, of course, is one of the things that drives some parts of the sort of wider debate on migration, and not least of all when we have absolutely catastrophic incidents as we've so recently had.
But you're doing really well at anticipating all the questions I was about to ask. So I was about to say, why is this, do you think it's so fraught in the wider community, this debate, and across the Western world indeed?
Well, I mean, in Australia, waves of immigration have been accompanied by voices of protest and anxiety for, I suppose, a variety of reasons.
We didn't like the Irish back in the 19th century.
No, and when we arrived in the 1970s, it was Greeks and
Yes.
Italians.
Yes.
I wasn't one of those. And then in the 80s, the late 70s, in fact, even, the Vietnamese,
Mm.
and then the Chinese. And then after the sort of Iran-Iraq war that was when Muslims began to arrive. And so Australia has been incredibly generous and I think incredibly successful at incorporating people from all over the world and responding to particular kinds of crises. I mean,
So is that history worth reflecting on? Because like some of the rhetoric from Christian politicians, interestingly, and from Christians as well, actually, multiculturalism is a disaster. It's really not working. It's it can't work. We're seeing that with violent outbreaks. Is your response to say, well, actually, no, the facts tell a different story?
I certainly believe that Australia is a hugely successful multicultural society. There are certainly challenges, and it can appear, it's easy to make multiculturalism the reason for a number of issues that we might be experiencing.
Yes.
I mean, I don't know if I'm rushing in where angels fear to tread. This is something that archbishops don't usually do.
I think this whole conversation probably is.
But for example, radicalisation, religious or political, does not need to be migrated into the country.
Mm.
You can access it online. So you could keep everybody out. You wouldn't keep radicalisation out. So, it's just not that simple. And I'm not saying that anybody is suggesting that it is, but I'm saying that is one aspect which is particularly kind of hot at the moment for obvious reasons.
Mm.
And certainly the kind of violence that we have recently experienced, and there has been discussion, about, I think the Prime Minister has referenced this as well, the sort of importing of conflict, not just migration of people, but the migration here of conflicts in other places. That certainly creates a challenge to social cohesion, and you can understand why people would think, well, now where has this come from? Why are we experiencing this conflict in our country when we are not engaged in this conflict? And there is there is a legitimate kind of concern being expressed there.
You're so right about the online nature, and people are, I think, underestimating how much an online global world has changed the global political and cultural atmosphere. And even thinking about Christianity, so we often think about radical Islam, but in terms of radicalisation of Christians, I think we're seeing some of that radicalisation of Christians being imported from the online world. So if we think of, the shooting in Queensland, similarly, I think that's something that we're not, I think, as Christians grappling with that well either. I don't think it's a very large section of Christians in Australia at all. No. But certainly part of the issue in terms of social cohesion, I think.
Yes, I agree with you, Megan. I do think it is. I think it's very marginal.
Mm.
But the point is, you can't exclude it.
Mm.
You can't. If you can access something online, you can't exclude it.
For good and bad, probably. Well, you've already talked quite a bit, I think, about some of the biblical and theological frame, and you've particularly talked about Pentecost, which is such a significant moment of unity across difference. But what about so if we look back at the Old Testament, perhaps, and some of the conversation there about the stranger and the sojourner, how could that potentially help us frame the political debate today?
Yeah, thank you. I mean, it's such an important part of Old Testament
Mm,
ethics, which culminates, of course, in the gospel itself.
mm,
The openness of the people of God to the stranger, to the alien, to those who, like them, have experienced slavery and depression and what have you. That openness is ultimately incarnated in the person of Jesus
yes,
Christ.
yes, yes.
And so the proclamation of his lordship is a hospitable one,
Mm,
not a totalitarian one. Right?
yes, yes.
Jesus is Lord, every knee will bow and every tongue confess. But in the proclamation of the gospel, people are being offered the opportunity
Mm,
to respond to Jesus as King
mm,
in a way which secures their ultimate good
mm,
as well as his glory. That creates this community where difference is present
mm,
and welcome, but subordinate to union with Christ.
mm,
He draws us up, as it were, into relationship with the triune God, which necessitates this the creation of fellowship between those who are drawn to him by the same gospel. Now, that means that in relation to a kind of diverse kind of community, we are both those who experience the hospitality of God and offer hospitality to others.
mm,
That seems to me to have direct practical implications. I mean,
mm.
when I was a child and we were newly arrived in Australia and we had no family here, my father died of a heart attack after we'd lived in Australia for 6 months.
Oh, wow.
And so my mother, a migrant woman
Mm,
with no family support, was widowed at the age of 40 with 3 young children.
mm,
Our next door neighbour was an elderly Anglo-Saxon Australian woman. I remember her name, Mrs. Huckstep, and she opened her home to us children, because my mother was working. We would come home from school and we would go into Mrs. Huckstep's home, where she would be watching afternoon television, but she had a glass of milk and ice bovos on her kitchen table, I kid you not. And the only thing I know about Mrs. Huckstep, apart from this kind of kindness, which as a child I thought, why is this happening? But anyway, it's good. I like ice bovos. The only thing I knew about her is that on the weekends, she crossed the street to the Catholic convent across the road. That's all I know about her.
mm, mm,
That every week she would go over there, presumably to Mass.
mm,
She was a practicing Catholic.
mhm.
And she had this widowed migrant family next door to her
From a different religion.
from a different religion
Mm,
to whom she apparently spontaneously offered kindness and assistance and a kind of connection with this community in which we actually had very little connection. We just arrived. And that seems to me to say something about the hospitality of the gospel,
mm,
actually.
mm.
And so, in an unexpected way, we experienced God's kindness through his people at that moment.
That's an extraordinary invitation to the kind of opportunity that Christians have to model the hospitality of the gospel in our current situation, I would say.
Absolutely. Absolutely. I think it's very easy for native-born Australians, if I put it that way, to underestimate how disruptive, isolated, and confusing it is to be a migrant.
Mm,
Sri Lankan migrants of my mother's generation all spoke English. They learnt English in Sri Lanka as the national language. They learnt their own language as a secondary language. That gave us an advantage as migrants over migrants who aren't fluent or competent, at least, in English when they arrive. Language, of course, helps you to connect with people across cultural difference because it's such a powerful vehicle of culture.
yes,
There's misunderstandings that arise in the way you use language, as I referred to earlier.
yes, yeah, yes.
But nevertheless, it's an essential element. The average Australian, I think, really has little insight into how lonely it is and how much the average migrant would love to have an Australian friend, what they would call an Australian friend. And so, that kind of drift to your own community, which creates the impression of ghettoization or
Mm,
it is simply it's simply trying to find a way.
yes.
My parents' generation all trotted down to the Asian spice shop in Bondi that was actually run by an Indian Jew.
Oh, right.
Of course.
His name was Moses. And that was the place. It was the only place you could buy the right spices.
Kosher spices.
So my family and my mother and her peers, they'd all meet there and talk about, well, now how do you do this and how do you do that and how do you get by and how do you make these things work in this kind of place? So there's tremendous opportunity for Christians who have experienced the hospitality of God in the gospel to offer hospitality. And, I mean, so many do, right? I mean, we have at least 80 of our Anglican churches in Sydney run language class, which is essentially an exercise in hospitality.
Yes, and I know Kaylee, your wife, is quite a leader in that area.
She's one of the team that kind of support churches that are doing this. And it is such a wonderful expression of hospitality and welcome by the Christian community. And I know, other denominations also run exactly the same kind of ministries. And what they do is put people face to face. Yes, hopefully people are learning some English. Hopefully they're learning something about the Bible as well. But they are developing relationships with real people. Relationships with people, that is a great bulwark of social cohesion and harmony.
Yeah. I was going to say, I mean, this is political, right? This is a great political thing to do because you change the community in doing it.
Yeah, sure.
As well as evangelistic, as well as everything else. It changes the tone. I mean, I love the symbol of the ice vovo as a kind of introduction to Australian culture.
Which is Kevin Rudd's favourite biscuit too, I believe.
There you go. Does that commend it to some and maybe not others?
No, probably.
I mean, I was going to finish actually by asking about what kind of leadership, if you had a room full of pastors and church leaders, lay church leaders maybe, what kind of leadership is needed into this particular cultural moment with this discussion on immigration, do you think, right now?
I think it needs to be gentle. The scriptures, Peter, Paul, Titus, I'm thinking of, they continually exhort Christian minorities, and let's say we are a minority now, exhort Christians to be subject to rulers, to be ready to do whatever is good, Paul says in Titus, to be peaceable and considerate, Titus 3 I'm thinking of, and to always be gentle to everyone. I think migrants are actually vulnerable people. They are made in God's image. Jesus' death is sufficient for their sins. And as Christians participating in this community and in these kinds of debates, we ought to recognise that immigration policy is a very complex subject. There are all kinds of immigrants, right? There are students and tourists and skilled workers and family reunion, refugees. It's a complex issue. It is entirely appropriate for a government to control immigration. God appoints boundaries and peoples and places where people live, and governments legitimately exercise management of that. But the ability to control your border doesn't somehow exclude churches, especially, most especially, responding to this issue with gospel-shaped responses. So there's no kind of straight line from a biblical text to what our position should be on this. It's more complex than that, so don't expect everybody to agree. Expect there to be disagreement, but expect that where the scripture directs us in the kinds of relationships that we have, even with those who oppose us, that's the context of the New Testament kind of exhortations in 1 Peter or in Titus. Even in that context, we're exhorted to honour all people, to share the gospel while protecting the rights of others, practice their beliefs. It is a pluralist society, but that creates great opportunity and, if not great obligation, for us to engage in ways that are shaped by the gospel and hold it out to others.
That's an absolute fantastic way to draw this back together, I think, to renew our gospel heart in terms of how we think about this issue, because it's so easy for us, I think, to, as you say before, be thinking about fear or be thinking about some of the pragmatics about how this might affect us, But to think about our church's response as a gospel response, I think is an absolutely perfect place to bring us all together here with this. It's been fantastic to speak to you and also to hear little bits of your story. I was sort of thinking I make actually an ice vovo tart, and I'm now thinking I need to make it and drop it round to St Andrew's house at some point.
I shall look forward to that, Megan.
But yeah, it's really great to have you with us. Thank you for making the time.
Pleasure to be here. Thanks for having me.